Everybody, this is part 2 for chapter 13, the correctional officer, right? So before I get speaking about what I have here on the board, it's something I don't think can be said enough and cannot be stated firmly enough. It's always important to remember that corrections officers are also in prison. They may be able to go home at the end of their shift, whether it's 8 hours or 16 hours or what have you, but they are still in prison for the time that they're at work. They are behind concrete and steel. They are in a cold environment. They are locked up with some dangerous people very often. They're certainly locked up with people who have committed crimes. So that is something that has to be at the start of this discussion. They are already locked up with their clients. Okay. The primary incentive for taking a job in the correctional field is the security of employment, right? It's a civil service job. So there is some security there. There are rules to get the job, and there are rules to take it away. The benefits in a civil service job are considered better than those in the private sector for the most part. But you're probably trading off a little salary for those benefits, those secure benefits, right? But it's also important to remember that they are the crucial professional in the environment, in the prison environment, because they're the ones that keep the safety and security of the facility going. They keep it safe and secure that the treatment professionals can do their jobs, and sometimes there is some conflict there. There is also an issue with discrimination against female corrections officers, right? They are, oddly enough, they are more respected with the higher the security level, right? So the maximum security, the women that work in maximum security prisons generally get more respect from the inmates than those who are in the medium and minimum security prisons. I don't know why that is. Maybe it's because of the stricter, the harsher environment of the maximum security prison. There's less of an opportunity for discrimination, but it is something that has been proven in studies, right? Female corrections officers are thought to soften the environment of the prisons, right? Soften the time for corrections for the inmates. So maybe that's what they're talking about is the nurturing side of women. I don't know how sexist that is, but it is something that has also been written about more than once. And something also to remember about corrections officers is that their training is robust. Now, corrections officer training at the low end is 2 weeks in some places, but in most places it's a series of months. In New York City, it's 6 months now, right? So you're trained in a whole bunch of different things. You're trained in you're peace officers essentially. So corrections officers in New York City are trained in the law. They get a lot of the same training that police officers get, but then they have to understand how the custody works of a prison, right? So it's very robust training, right? The different assignments that corrections officers get vary, right? So probably the most well-known is the officer assigned to the block where the inmates are, right? So you'll have a series of officers, maybe 5, maybe 9, maybe 20, whatever, and then you'll have 30, 40, 60, 100 inmates in that block, right? And they're responsible for keeping control of it. Now, it's important to know that there is no set officer to inmate ratio. There are some recommendations that have been made, but the recommendations vary. I've seen it as much as low as 1 officer for every 9 inmates, and I've seen it as 1 officer for every 20 inmates. And I think that's simply a matter of perspective for who's asking the question and who's answering the question, right? But the cell block officer, the officer in the cell block, he's responsible for maintaining the day-to-day operation. The officer in the shop might have in some ways a little bit more of a challenging job, because these are, when I say shop, I mean any place where there's some sort of work being done or training that's being provided to the inmates. So there's potential for things that could be used as weapons. In some cases, weapons. If it's a machine shop, there'll definitely be weapons. But also if there's sewing, cooking, whatever, there are weapons there. The officers who are in the yard, as is recreational time, is the time out of the cell. They're in large groups together in an open area. That can be problematic. So that is one of the issues with those jobs. And then you have people who show some capability, some have some education, maybe some administrative capability. They get an administrative job, an administrative role, right? Then there's the officers that provide the transport to and from other prisons, to and from courts, to and from treatments. You know, at Bellevue Hospital where I work, we have officers come in from Rikers Island to escort patients in for treatment, or sometimes from upstate correctional facilities as well, because of maybe some specific care that we provide here that is not offered upstate. And then you have officers who provide the relief for all these other jobs, and this is, generally speaking, probably a newer officer who's providing relief, so he's getting to learn all the different jobs, maybe to locate his strength, and maybe just to make sure that he's well-rounded. And then, of course, you have the supervisors who are in charge of all of these officers in all of their positions, right? Probably the most prevalent, most well-known role is that of the tough security officer, right? The toughness. It's respected amongst your peers to be tough, right? To be the type of officer who doesn't take anything from the inmates, or who controls the inmates. Somebody who's a tough officer is very well respected. And the problem with that is that as the acceptable level of violence in the institutions has gone down, that toughness is something that is less exhibited, and something that works less because you can't back it up, right? So, although that's not entirely the case, depending on force of will, but toughness is respected, and it's mostly respected among the officers, but in some cases it is respected amongst the inmates as well. They respect you if you're ready to get into a physical altercation with them, right? I guess that's maybe the environment that they're living in, and so they respect an officer that can have that tough role, right? There was in the years gone by, and probably in some facility somewhere, when an inmate came into a facility, they were put in a gauntlet, right? So they were given they were given their manual for how the rules are. They were given instruction. They were given haircuts. They were given clothes, and how that all went, and how much resistance they went, dictated how much physical force was used against them. And the corrections officer used to say that set the tone for control of the facility. And without that time, that was kind of brutal in some ways, they've lost control of the facility. The facility has kind of become more unruly and violent because they're not allowed to engage in that behavior anymore, right? It's also considered people work, right? Corrections officers is considered people work. You're working with hundreds of people every day, right? So it is people work. And there is a contradiction of the police officer that is exhibited just in these two words, toughness and people, right? Yes, you're expected to be tough, but you're expected to work with people. But essentially what's happening is corrections officers are expected to be able to help inmates deal with their day-to-day problems and sometimes personal issues, right? While they're working in a cold, impersonal environment. And one of the biggest criticisms that corrections officers have in their environment is that it is impersonal to them. Now this is a contradiction that exists in a lot of law enforcement positions, right? They want you to be helpful and kind and respectful to the inmates, but they expect you to adhere to rules. And sometimes your supervisors do not treat you the way that they want you to treat the inmates. And that's the type of a contradiction that makes it hard. It makes it hard for a CO to be kind and respectful to the inmate when the people who are in charge of them aren't treating them the same way, right? So that's a contradiction that has been stated and is being addressed in some places. In the healthcare environment, they call that the just culture, where everything is fair. You're allowed to admit a mistake, and it doesn't always mean that you're going to be, default automatically to discipline, right? So corrections and peace officers, police officers, they've kind of adapted that. We have to treat people fairly. We have to treat the people that work with us fairly if we expect them to treat the people they're in charge of fairly as well. There are some problems with the correction profession, right? Conflicting custodial and treatment goals, right? So this is what I alluded to this earlier, and I alluded to this in part one. Your job is to keep the facility safe and secure, and the people in it safe and secure. But the treatment people are trying to build relationships, right? Part of the way treatment works is to build a rapport, to build an emotional connection with your charges, and these are prisoners. So many of them have violent histories, right? Some of them don't, but with the corrections officers, they generally are expected to treat everybody the same. So they treat everybody the same rules. You have to step here, go there. When I say move, you move, don't move. And that contradicts with the individualized treatment that the healthcare professionals or the psychiatric professionals are trying to use to help inmates improve their mental status and improve their condition and make it more possible for them to survive in the outside world, right? And the corrections officers are the key figure for control despite the conflicting goals, right? Stress and burnout is a huge factor for corrections officers. You have this conflict here, and you know, outside world, we tend to focus on, you know, the treatment, right? We want these treatment professionals. They'll write their papers and say, oh, the corrections officers aren't on the same page as us, and so there's a whole level of intellectuals out there who aren't recognizing the importance of the security and the safety of the facility, right? And that leads to stress and burnout. These contradictions lead to stress and burnout. The understanding, the recognition that you are locked up just like the inmates leads to stress and burnout. And so there's a high turnover rate, right? There's a high turnover rate with corrections officers because it's a very hard job. And we've made reference in the past in our class about how corrections policy has been a series of fads, right? So things keep changing because someone comes up with an idea, but there's never really any empirical research or scientific research that proves that it's going to work. So they come up with an idea, it sounds good, people on the outside are willing to fund it, the warden needs, everything else isn't working, so the warden or the governor decides, hey, we should try this. And so they change the rules on the corrections officers 10 years into their career, right? And that also makes it very hard. All right, I'm going to get to civil service left, right? So the violations of rules that corrections officers face start with personal relationships that go too far. So they're expecting you to build relationships, right? And the treatment goals are building relationships, and what happens is sometimes they go too far. There have been studies done about the manipulation that inmates use on guards, on female guards, on treatment professionals, and so these are all kind of things you have to be wary of right from the start. That there is a place for personal relationships, but if they go too far, what you're talking about now is a violation of the rules or sometimes criminal rules, and if you engage in a romantic relationship with an inmate, that is in at least a violation of policy. In some states it's a violation of law. If you become so close that you start doing favors for them, either inside or outside, that's also at the very least a violation of policy. Could be a violation of law depending on what you're bringing in, contraband coming into the prison. You know, you're trying to help them deal with personal issues, but you're breaking the rules to do it, and that's like the how the slow developing corruption goes on, right? But more of what goes on, and has been historically a problem, is the use of force by corrections officers in the prison, right? First and foremost, you're allowed to defend yourself against assault from an inmate, right? You're allowed to defend yourself. And so that's fine, right? You're allowed to defend others. You're allowed to defend other inmates. You're allowed to defend the treatment professionals. You're allowed to defend the support staff. And you're allowed to use physical force to a certain extent to enforce the rules, to prevent crimes, and to prevent escapes, right? But what's lacking here, what isn't in the corrections officers' textbook here, the correctional textbook here, is the force continuum that we have in police officer uses of force, right? Your professional presence, your verbal interactions, physical interactions with your hands, then you can start using your tools, your baton, your taser, your pepper spray, your firearm, right? The force continuum isn't as clearly defined here. Now, you can use it in all these circumstances, but they don't specifically define these things. And that's because the use of force by corrections officers is not defended by the objectionably reasonable standard that the Supreme Court uses to assess the force that police officers use, right? Objectionably reasonable means that it's hard for someone in a courtroom or in a classroom to assess a use of force that the officer had to use in a split second at a moment's notice, right? That objectionably reasonable status has not been given to corrections officers. So that shows that the rules are changing pretty regularly for the corrections officers and how they use force, right? But let's not kid anybody. Uses of force by corrections officers have often gone too far, right? Beating people down, that initiation process. If you didn't follow the rules, you got some sort of physical punishment. These are the reasons why the rules changed, because of the physical brutality that have been a part of correctional officers' control tools, right? The tools that they use to control. Understanding when enough force is enough to defend yourself, to defend others, to enforce rules, to prevent crimes, and prevent escapes. And in most law enforcement agencies, it's the minimal amount of force necessary is the standard, right? And we're not so sure that it's clearly defined for corrections officers, although in places like New York it is, right? We touched on the civil service employment that corrections officers generally are, not always. In private prisons, they do not have civil service protection. In some places they hire provisionals, what they call provisionals, which is they hire you before the civil service test or the civil service process is given, and so your job is in jeopardy, is not as secure as it is when you pass the test and get hired through that way. Civil service protects jobs. And in a job with high burnout and changing rules, it's having some sort of job protection is important, right? It also provides benefits through collective bargaining, and those are the benefits I talked about, where which is the primary incentive, secure employment to take care of your family, right? It makes the job available to all. So one of the problems with the job environment is, forget about just personal prejudices and biases, right? If you're left with the decision to hire somebody, you want to hire somebody you trust, and the people you trust are the people in your circle, family members and friends, right? So if I'm in charge of hiring and all I hire is my family and friends, there's a whole segment of the population out there who is being denied the opportunity to get a decent job, right? So that's why civil service law exists, right? So if you take a test, there's a hiring application process that is monitored, screened, and defined by law, and you have to follow these processes, and that makes the job available to everyone, right? And it also provides management structure for the job. So when you get into the job, you know who the boss is. If you take a second test and become a boss, you know who works for you, and then you know who's above you. And that management structure is also part of the civil service in a lot of cases, right? Essentially what civil service provides is fairness. And it's sometimes the only fairness that you encounter in a job that, once again, I want to say it, you are locked up. You are locked up in a prison with the prisoners, and the only fairness you have is the security of your civil service employment. And that's a tough thing sometimes, right? So that's it for chapter 13. We'll get on chapter 14 in a minute. Thanks.